You're listening to Collected, stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Maher.
Today we're going to be looking at some objects that speak to women's service in the Royal Australian Air Force, clothing, personal equipment, and we'll also be looking at some images of some rather more intimate issue equipment that women enjoyed or perhaps didn't during wartime in the Air Force.
That's Emily Hiles, Assistant Curator of Military Heraldry and Technology. We'll take a closer look a little later at the women's uniforms she's got to show us, including those pictures of underwear known as blackouts and twilights. We're also going to hear about the early participation of Indigenous women in the Air Force. But first, how did women get into the Australian Air Force? Well, during the First World War, Australian women had served as army nurses, as ambulance drivers, and in many volunteer roles supporting soldiers and raising funds for wartime charities. In Britain, just before the start of the Second World War, a women's auxiliary air force, the WAAF, was formed to release officers and airmen of the Royal Air Force for operational duty. But according to senior historian Dr. Lachlan Grant, Australia was slower to recruit women into the services and wartime industries.
One of the key obstacles at the time was social stigmas of the era about women's roles in the workplace, what were considered men's jobs, the type of workwear that women would be wearing in the workplace if they were to work in factories or as mechanics in the Air Force. And there was also concerns that if women gained these skills in the war at the time, that they would take up jobs for returning men at the end of the war.
You say that other countries were faster than Australia in recruiting women. What sort of jobs did they start recruiting women in, and how did that recruitment finally start in Australia?
Well, the jobs that they were taking up in the Royal Air Force in Britain were things like working telephones, working the operations room. And in films like the Battle of Britain, you see the famous scenes of the women pushing the markers around the desk as the battle's unfolding, working in radar and signals, so interpreting signals and radar, meteorology, but also working as mechanics and armourers and actually working with the aircraft. And even in Britain, women were trained as pilots as well to help deliver aircraft from the factories to the operational squadrons, but they would not fly operationally, but they were trained as pilots to deliver aircraft.
In fact, quite a few Australian women who found themselves in the UK at the start of the war joined the British WAAF. But what about Australian women back home who wanted to serve?
Well, the Royal Australian Air Force was the leader in Australia in this regard, and it was continually pushing the government through 1941 to be able to recruit women into the Air Force. And eventually the government agreed. In March 1941, the Women's Auxiliary Australian Air Force was established, and it allowed women to enlist in the Air Force. And over the course of the war, over 27,000 Australian women served in the WAAF in Australia. And by comparison, that's the number of Australian airmen who served in Britain during the Second World War. So essentially, it could have freed up that manpower to allow Australia to continually send trained air crews overseas.
What sort of women joined up?
Oh, well, it was typical in terms of motivation to join up from anyone of that era. Most of them just wanted to do their thing, play their role and contribute to something quite bigger, serve the nation. The Air Force was an attractive service. Some women said, well, I couldn't see myself riding around on a tank. And the lure of air travel and aircraft at the time, the Air Force was a very popular service for men and women to enlist in during the Second World War. And even a factor for the Air Force is they had much smarter uniforms than the other services of the era. And that was always a big attraction for men and women to enlist in the RAAF.
Was the pay good for these women?
Well, the Australian Council of Trade Unions throughout the war was pushing the Australian government that women in the services should be paid equal to their male counterparts in their roles and musterings and ranks. But that was never to be. In the Air Force and in the other services, the women were paid 2/3 the rate of their male counterparts. So they didn't achieve that equality, but But it's worth noting that at the time that was still higher than the industrial award rates at the time, but still it's not equal to equal pay for equal work.
The WAAF was the first military organisation in Australia that allowed women roles beyond tending the sick or wounded, and it paved the way for similar organisations in the Army and Navy. The women worked across more than 70 different musterings or trades. They were mechanics, truck drivers, engineers, signallers, stewards and caterers. They worked in kitchens, hospitals and offices. They worked with machine guns, radar and parachutes. Lachlan's own grandmother was in the WAAF. Her work was top secret.
My nana, Edna Dixon, during the Second World War, she was from a small town of Dowsford in regional Victoria, and when she enlisted in the Air Force during the Second World War, like many women around Australia, it was the first time she had lived away from her home, her small regional Australia. She moved to Melbourne and other parts of Victoria to do her training and was working at an establishment near Albert Park in Melbourne. Nana wouldn't tell me years after the war what she did. She said it was a secret. She was very loyal, and obviously during the war she was told you can't talk about the type of work that was going on in this office, so she didn't in the years after the war. But I think she was working in one of the signals and direct intelligence directorates agencies that were located in that part of Melbourne for the Air Force during the war. And after the war, she was asked to stay in the Air Force, and they offered to send her to Melbourne Uni to do further skills and training, but she wanted to return home to her country town and her family.
Did she keep her uniform?
Well, when she was donating my grandfather's uniform, I of course asked her, Nana, what about your uniform? Do you still have your Air Force uniform? And she said, well, I grew up during the Depression, and the uniform I was given in the Air Force was the best quality clothing I ever had at that time. So after the war, she turned into a nice dress jacket and skirt. And we suspect that many women did the same thing, and this is why in our collection at the memorial we don't have as many items of WAAF uniforms as we do of Australian men's uniforms from the Air Force and from the Army for that reason.
During the Second World War, as you say, Lachlan, the women in the WAAF had mainly a supporting role across a wide variety of areas. They weren't allowed to take on the operational roles that men were doing at the time, but they certainly did pave the way for women to be the sort of women in the Air Force that we see now.
Oh, absolutely. This first generation of women who served in the Air Force did pave the way for those who came after, and there was one Australian pilot in the Second World War who trained in Britain with the pilots in Britain, and she flew G for George, our famous Lancaster, here at the memorial during its victory tour of Australia in 1945. And
what was her name?
She was Flight Officer Marty Gething of the Air Transport Auxiliary, and during the war she flew 42 different types of aircraft in England, delivering them from factories to the squadrons. And when she came back to Australia, flew our famous G for George. And then after the war she became a flight instructor based in Mildura in northwestern Victoria, training many other pilots, and perhaps some of the pilots who would go on and fly in the Air Force in the post-1945 era.
You say that your nana went home after the war. Is that what most women in the WAAF did, or do we have any figures as to how many stayed on in the armed services?
We don't have the figures to hand, but most of the women went back to their home lives and went back to that homemaker role, and in the 1950s supported their families, and really it was the daughters of this Second World War generation in the 60s and 70s that helped push the movement of equality. But it was born through some of the work that their mothers had done during the Second World War era.
How did your nana rate her war service as compared to your grandfather's war service?
My nana would often talk about my grandfather's war service and was very humble about her own service. And if you remind her, but Nana, you also served in the war too, and it was very much of I just sort of did my bit. It wasn't anything special. Yeah, and did my part in something that was much bigger.
And do you think that that was a common attitude of women at the time, that because they weren't the ones who were overseas in the jungles, in the desert, fighting the enemy face to face, that they didn't see their contribution as important?
Oh, I think a lot of Second World War veterans around Australia felt the same way, that they were just doing their little bits. And as you say, particularly those who weren't in the jungles in New Guinea or in the deserts at Tobruk, they felt like that was where the real sort of sacrifices were being made, or by those who had the unfortunate circumstance of being a prisoner of war. Yeah, they just very much thought they just did their job, didn't necessarily ask for any special recognition afterwards, even though they went from their lives wherever they were in Australia to go and move away for years to another part of Australia to do their job and come back again years later to take up where they'd left off. But they weren't calling for anything special or special acknowledgement.
But when you think about it, their work was vital to the war effort.
Oh, absolutely vital. Without all those volunteers, and they were all volunteers who enlisted in the WAAF, they all contributed to the great Allied victory in the Second World War. So much work was done behind the lines. There was 1 million Australians served in the Second World War in uniform, 500,000 served overseas. So that other 500,000 was enabling the forces to be able to be deployed overseas.
Women in the WAAF came from all stratas of Australian society. But what about Indigenous women? Up until 1949, Indigenous Australians were officially barred from joining the Defence Force, but it didn't stop them from serving their country in both the First and the Second World Wars. The Airforce was less restrictive than the other services, and this opened the way for Indigenous women to join the WAAF. Gary Oakley is a former exhibitions curator at the War Memorial, who's now an Indigenous historian with the Royal Australian Air Force. So far, his research has uncovered more than 25 women who were part of the Women's Auxiliary, but he's keen to learn more. I caught up with Gary on Zoom.
What the research is doing, it draws people out. So people are coming out all the time. And it's things like these little podcasts and talks that pull people out, because you do a talk and people then go, oh, I had an auntie that was in the Air Force, or I have such and such that was in the Air Force. And I've worked with young Indigenous women in the Air Force today, and you talk to them and they go, oh, my auntie was in the Air Force during the Second World War. So there's also a tradition of family service. So we'll never really know, but we've got probably 25 to 30 that we definitely know.
One of those women was Alice Lovett.
Alice Lovett's a young woman. She's Victorian. She comes from a long line of serving members, the Lovett family. Alice was in the Air Force for about a year and a half. She didn't leave Australia. Most of the all the females that I know so far did not leave Australia or didn't serve overseas. I think she was a stewardess. I can't remember. But she's pretty typical of all those young women that joined. And when I was looking at them, the average age is roughly around about 19 to 22. But Alice is interesting in that her family, the Lovetts, they have a long tradition of serving from the First World War right up to the present day. And when Veterans Affairs had their building in Woden here in Canberra, Lovett Towers was actually named after the family because of their very large defence family.
The memorial has a series of black and white photos of Alice. One is a 1944 wedding portrait with her husband, signalman Claude MacDonald. He's in uniform, she's wearing a jaunty little hat. Another shows her with two girlfriends on a Melbourne street. They're in civilian clothes, but Alice is wearing her WAAF uniform, a smart skirt and jacket, a collared shirt and tie, and a cap. My favourite photos appear to be taken on the same day in 1942, again on a street in Fitzroy. In one, Alice is with one of her friends from the later photo, Mary West. In the other, she's standing alongside her uncle, Private Samuel Peacock. In both of these photos, Alice is wearing her WAAF-issued voluminous overalls, cinched in with a belt at the waist. More on those overalls soon. You're listening to Collected, Stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Maher.
Yep, so we are looking at a boiler suit or overalls. They are faded grey, perhaps they were once a darker blue. They were issued to women who joined the Air Force, WAAFs in Australia, initially because there wasn't uniforms for women. The Australian version of the British WAAF was basically the same framework as the British one, but we didn't have the uniforms. So women, upon joining the Air Force in Australia as WAAFs, or in the RAAF as the case of this boiler suit is, were issued with a boiler suit and a beret for training until such time as they managed to get uniforms. Across Australia and Britain, all women seem to have recorded that they got this kit bag full of uniforms that would definitely not fit them. So if you were tall, they seemed to be for a short person and vice versa. But it was that era of make, do and mend.
So who did this particular boiler suit belong to?
Well, it belonged to a woman called Mildred Hutchings, and it's quite an unusual service for her because she was a doctor at outbreak of war, but she also had a Class A pilot's licence. So she's the perfect person to join the Air Force. And although she herself was in the RAAF, her job was to minister to all the WAAFs around Australia and care for their health needs and give lectures. So 16 Australian women served as doctors in the RAAF during the Second World War. She didn't deploy overseas, but she spent the duration of the war taking care of WAAFs' health in Australia. She recorded that although she didn't wear the boiler suit during the war, she wore it after the war for all the dirty jobs, such as painting. And there's a few flecks of paint on the legs, which may attest to that.
So she would have eventually been issued with a skirt and a blazer, some sort of tunic to wear during her work as a doctor.
That's right, much the same as the men wore in the RAAF. The Women's Australian Auxiliary Air Force wore a navy blue tunic and very sensible length skirt with some sensible shoes.
Do you have many boiler suits like this in the memorials collection?
We do, but they're not typically belonging to women. We have boiler suits from particularly Navy and some from Air Force, but they tend to be for ground work. For example, Lockie spoke about our famous Lancaster G. George. We have the very stained overalls of one of the men who worked on George as ground crew. But yeah, I would hazard a guess that this is perhaps the only female Second World War Air Force boiler suit that we have in our collection.
Now, Emily, you also have not the actual items, but some pictures of some undergarments that might well have been worn under a boiler suit like this. What have you got here?
Well, I've got two images for you, Louise, of the underwear that was issued to Australian WAAFs during the Second World War, very similar, I imagine, to that was issued to British WAAFs. They speak to the time and perhaps the climate because they are woolen and they're very long, and they were universally known as blackouts or twilights. Many women refer to them in their memoirs about their time in the Air Force as passion killers. They invariably didn't fit very well. And there was quite a lot of romance during the Second World War, and WAAFs, as well as providing really valuable war work, also provided a really terrific social balance for men. So the blackouts and the twilights do tend to make a mention when you're reading anything about WAAFs because they're itchy, scratchy, uncomfortable, probably not very practical in Australian summers.
And not very attractive.
That's right, but one image that we're looking at with ribbed woolen knee-length blackouts, the text below them, Louise, says, "These are very warm and ideal for the woman in uniform." So it's all about practicality, not flair.
So the blackouts are woolen undergarments that reach down to the knees, and the twilights look like, well, woolen leggings, I suppose.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, in an era where people were required to block the light out, it was said that these underwear were so large and voluminous that you could use them to block out your whole window.
So you're showing me pictures of these. Normally you would show me the actual undergarments themselves. Does this mean that you don't have any in the collection?
That's right. We don't have any women's Second World War WAAF issue underwear, perhaps for reasons that Lockie's Nana kept. These are good quality things. They may not be the most attractive, but made of wool and probably long-lasting. So no, sadly we don't have any. We'd welcome any offers of donation.
Possibly, though, these are the sort of things that women would be embarrassed about, that they wouldn't understand, that they are worth contributing, that they're part of the history of women in the Air Force.
Yeah, that's right. I suppose if it were you or I, having deployed overseas operationally, if we thought about donating our uniforms to the memorial, we'd perhaps draw the line at our very personal undergarments. So, yeah, that would make a lot of sense.
So if we just turn around, Emily, I can see that you've brought in a large, shallow cardboard box, which is sitting on a trolley here. And inside the box is a khaki bomber jacket that looks exactly like the sort of bomber jackets you see people in the Defence Force wearing now. But this is a very special one. Can you describe this for us and tell us who it belonged to?
Yeah, so it's an olive drab flying jacket, Louise. It's got... interestingly, a bright orange lining throughout. If I just pull up the bottom, you can see bright orange sateen lining.
Yeah, it's lovely, isn't it, really?
And this was worn by an Australian woman called Patricia Furbank, always known as Furby, who was a nurse. She started her training at Lithgow, age 16, and at the outbreak of the Vietnam War, she found herself applying for all three services and decided she'd go with whichever one took her first, and that was the Air Force. So she enlisted in the Air Force as a young nurse. One of her first postings after her initial training was to No. 3 Hospital at Richmond, and that's the squadron badge that is sewn onto the proper right side of her flying jacket. She's also got epaulets up here, which indicate her rank. Women in the Air Force had male rank, but her rank is quite unclear because she's known as section officer, which is a WAAF rank, and also squadron leader, which is a RAAF rank. But in any case, we've got the rod of Asclepius, the medical symbol. The god of medicine and healing is the symbol of the medical corps.
And that's like a little badge under a little plastic covering there.
That's right. It's a little golden badge. And Furby, sister Patricia Furbank, wore this jacket, doing a really, really interesting job. After her training at No. 3 Richmond Hospital, initially she was there to receive all aeromedical evacuations from Vietnam. So as a young nurse, she's dealing with very serious surgical cases, some men who'd stepped on landmines, other men who'd sustained awful injuries, and men who'd experienced serious trauma, and men who had really severe malaria. So after a few months at Richmond in training, she was taught how to nurse on an aeroplane. And initially I thought, well, how different can it be? But in fact, it's quite different.
It would be so cramped to start with.
Very cramped. And I've got on the table behind you images from the interior of the type of aircraft she worked on.
And you can see the men sort of lined up on bunks, stretcher bunks.
Yeah, that's right. The interior and exterior shot there are both aircraft that she worked in, a Hercules C-130. Patients were brought on board and stacked up in 5 tiers. The least dangerous cases were put right up the top because they'd be less likely to need attention in flight, and the most severely wounded would be, within easy reach of the nurse. A single Hercules could carry up to 74 litter cases or stretcher cases, and only 2 nurses and a single doctor would be on that flight. So
to look after all those men.
That's right, on fairly long flights as well. So after her initial training at Richmond, Sister Furbank was posted to Butterworth, Penang, in what was then Malaya, and a very, very interesting job because she was attached to No. 4 RAAF Hospital, and her role there was to act as an aeromedical evacuation nurse on flights from Vung Tau in Vietnam back to Butterworth and then on back to Australia, to Richmond generally. The Australian Air Force nursing service did not have a base in Vietnam. Australian Army had women nursing in Vietnam, but nurses were in Malaya, close by, a 4-hour flight. And she undertook 84 aeromedical evacuations from Vung Tau back to Australia via Butterworth. So it's a huge number. And during her time, she was seconded to the United States Air Force. I suspect she was very good at her job. and she was based at Clark Field in the Philippines. And there she undertook 45 aeromedical evacuations. In an interview that she gave before she died in 2006, she spoke to the difficulties in nursing in a flight, not just the fact that you may have gravely wounded men and very sick men, but she mentioned the necessity of being very agile, being able to access all the litters at, high and low in the 5 tiers on board. But some things that I wouldn't have thought about, Hercules are renowned for their noise. They're very, very noisy, and crew operating in them would speak to each other on intercom. She didn't like wearing a headset. She found it inhibited her movements. And she mentioned that taking the blood pressure of seriously ill men was really difficult because you couldn't hear the hiss of the blood through the stethoscope, and other technical difficulties that you'd encounter nursing on an aeroplane. For example, IV fluids had to be stopped before takeoff because they would drain out. Any eye wounds or abdominal cases would have to be very, very closely monitored because of the increased pressure and the capacity for vessels to burst. Patients with orthopaedic injuries couldn't have plaster on board because if they were to crash, they wouldn't stand a chance in a water ditching scenario. They'd be too heavy. That refers me back to her olive green flying jacket here. The RAAF typically wore blue. She was wearing olive green because she was in a tropical environment.
It's pretty hot for a tropical environment, though.
I can't actually see any photos of her wearing the jacket in flight. I imagine it would have been more of a shirt sleeves environment, but perhaps in the cooler monsoonal months in Penang she would have worn it. But the lining inside is bright orange because in case of a ditching you would be able to reverse your jacket so it was bright orange and you'd be much more visible to alert the rescuers who were coming to get you.
After the difficulty of the work you've just described that Furby had to do to help rescue these wounded and these very sick Australian soldiers, I'm surprised to see these other objects that you've brought to show me because they are very nice looking, sensible court shoes, and by that I mean they're leather shoes with quite a heel on them, and these belong to Patricia as well.
Yes, they did. She wore these at number 4 RAAF Hospital in Butterworth. They're quite high heels for trudging around a ward all day, but such was the time, and they wore small starched veils as well with tan-coloured pantyhose. And although the shoes aren't remarkable in themselves, and she wouldn't have worn these on her aeromedical evacuation flight, she would have worn boots for that.
But she would have worn these, as you said, on the wards.
That's right, and they're not heavily worn, but they're clearly well worn. And I think there's something very personal about a shoe. You can see the imprint of where her toe was. She's got rather little feet. She nursed for many, many years. She was a vocational nurse, nurse for life. No sooner had she retired from the Airforce, she was involved in aeromedical evacuations for Cyclone Tracy. She became nursing unit manager in Maryborough in Queensland. And like so many military nurses, they really put themselves last. It's all about caring for the boys. And I think Sister Furbank was clearly one of those really devoted Australian nurses. I always think of the words on the Nurses Memorial on Anzac Parade just down the road, beyond all praise. Very selfless women dealing with fairly traumatic events. And in fact, in her interview, she mentioned that during her training at Richmond, every time an aeromedical evacuation flight landed at Richmond, anti-war protesters would be there yelling, "Murderers, murderers," and holding placards. And you can imagine that sort of thing would be really, really wearing when you're just trying to do your best to help. Yeah, so a pretty extraordinary lady. So her shoes, although they're just a shoe, they can evoke all those thoughts about someone who's done such a valuable job for her entire working life.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Collected, Stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Maher. You can subscribe to the series by going to the Memorial's website or wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time.